665,000 tons of war machine, 100,000 men, one ship with no name, and a handful of heroes standing in its way. The morning of October 25, 1944, arrived with the sea calm and the sky clear, too clear for the men aboard the USS John C. Butler to sense the storm that was about to engulf them. This was the Philippine Sea, one of the most strategic areas of the Pacific theater. At its heart, the Japanese had unleashed their final armada, a mighty force led by the largest battleship ever built, the Yamato, a symbol of Imperial Japan's unyielding might. Towering over the horizon, her 10 18-inch guns, each capable of firing a 3,200-pound shell over 25 miles, made her a floating fortress, an unshakable symbol of Japan's naval power. But in its path was the smallest, most fragile fleet the United States Navy could muster. The USS John C. Butler, just 306 feet long, a mere speck against the massive steel leviathans. She had been built not for glory, but for survival. As a destroyer escort, her mission was simple: protect convoys, hunt submarines, and keep the bigger, more formidable ships safe. Little more than a tin can in the words of her crew, she was not designed to take on the likes of the Yamato. But in that moment, she and her crew would find themselves at the center of one of the most remarkable battles of the Second World War, where the impossible seemed to unfold right before their eyes. This was the battle off Samar, a confrontation no one thought would be possible. The men aboard the USS John C. Butler knew that they had no chance to defeat the Yamato. But they also knew they could not retreat. The only path left to them was one of resistance, a path fraught with unimaginable danger. In the shadow of an enemy fleet that could obliterate them with a single salvo, they would fight not for victory, but for survival, for time, and for the chance to protect their fellow soldiers and sailors. As the men on the Butler gathered for breakfast that morning, unaware of the storm that loomed, the clock was ticking down. Their fight was about to begin. October 25, 1944, Battle of Samar. In the early hours of October 25th, the calm of the morning shattered with the blaring of alarms, signaling the arrival of something far worse than they had expected. From the lookout stations of the USS John C. Butler, the men spotted the massive Japanese fleet rising from the haze. What they saw made their hearts stop, a wall of metal and firepower, led by the massive Yamato and her sister ships. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, each one a weapon of mass destruction, intent on wiping out the American beachhead on Leyte. At the helm of this iron fist was Admiral Teo Kurita, a man who would stop at nothing to eliminate the American threat. His orders were clear: destroy the American fleet and prevent the invasion of the Philippines from succeeding. The stakes were higher than ever. If the Americans held the Philippines, it would be a devastating blow to the Japanese war effort. The Philippines was the linchpin of Japan's oil supply, and without it, their entire war machine would grind to a halt. Yet, the American fleet had been caught off guard. Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet had been lured away, chasing what they believed to be Japanese carriers, leaving the small, vulnerable ships of Taffy III to hold the line. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. This was the force standing between over 100,000 American soldiers on the beaches of Leyte and the vast might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The odds seemed impossible. For Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy III, the mission was simple: get the carriers out of harm's way. His orders were to turn the carriers east and escape as fast as possible, launching every aircraft in their arsenal to provide cover. But Sprague knew that this wouldn't be enough. The carriers alone couldn't fend off the oncoming attack. It was the destroyers and destroyer escorts, the smallest ships in the fleet, that would have to face the wrath of the Japanese battleships. And so, in a move that defied all naval strategy, Sprague gave the order for the tiny escort ships to charge toward the enemy. They would turn and face the greatest battleships ever built, not to defeat them, but to delay them. They would fight not to win, but to buy time. Every second counted, and every shot fired could make the difference between life and death for the men on the beaches of Leyte. For the crew of the USS John C. Butler, the stakes couldn't have been higher. As the ships of Taffy III turned into the storm of steel, They knew their small arms and fragile hulls were no match for the enemy's firepower. But they also knew they couldn't back down. This was their moment. This was their stand. Taffy 3 faces overwhelming odds. October 25, 1944. The first Japanese shells crashed into the water with a thunderous roar, sending waves of spray into the air. The men aboard the USS John C. Butler scrambled to their battle stations, their hearts racing, their hands trembling as they loaded their guns. The noise was deafening, an endless barrage of explosions, the screech of shells tearing through the air, and the creaking of the ship's fragile hull as it absorbed each impact. Yet, despite the overwhelming firepower of the enemy, the men of Taffy 3 held their ground. They fired their small guns with desperate precision, aiming not to destroy but to distract, to confuse, and to delay. They knew they couldn't outfight the Yamato and her fleet, they could only buy time. And so, the sailors worked with mechanical precision, loading shells into their guns and firing into the smoke and chaos of battle. Among them was the USS Johnston, a destroyer that led the charge into the heart of the Japanese fleet. Commander Ernest E. Evans didn't hesitate. With courage that defied all logic, he turned his ship directly into the enemy's guns, firing torpedoes at a Japanese cruiser. The Johnston was hit repeatedly, her crew wounded, but Evans' actions ignited a fire in the rest of the fleet. His defiance, his determination, became a symbol of American resilience. On the USS John C. Butler, the crew watched as the Johnston pressed on, her guns blazing despite the odds. The men knew they couldn't win this battle, but they knew they had to keep fighting. Every second they bought for the carriers, every distraction they caused for the Japanese fleet, meant the difference between life and death for thousands of soldiers on the beaches. As the battle raged on, the sailors of the Butler continued to fire, their small guns barely scratching the surface of the mighty Japanese ships. But they weren't trying to win, they were trying to survive. Every shot they fired, every maneuver they made, was a desperate attempt to buy just a little more time. In the face of impossible odds, they chose to stand, to fight, and to make history. Johnston leads the charge. Taffy 3 stands its ground. The battle raged for hours, and by the time the dust settled, the cost was clear. The USS Johnston had been destroyed, her crew torn apart by the overwhelming force of the Japanese guns. The USS Hull, another destroyer, was crippled, her hull shattered by enemy fire. The Samuel B. Roberts, known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, had exhausted every shell, every torpedo, in a desperate bid to hold the line. But despite the losses, the small ships of Taffy 3 had achieved the impossible. The Japanese fleet, though battered and bloodied, had turned away. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, had been forced to retreat. But the victory came at a heavy cost. Over 1,000 American sailors were dead. Hundreds more were wounded or lost, at sea. The men of the John C. Butler had fought not for glory, but for survival. They had bought precious time for the carriers to escape, and in doing so, they had become legends. But the true cost of their courage was not measured in medals or citations. It was measured in the faces of the men who never came back, in the empty bunks, and in the names that would never be called at roll call again. As the Japanese fleet retreated, the survivors of Taffy 3 took stock of the destruction around them. The sea was littered with burning wreckage, the remnants of ships that had fought valiantly but ultimately been overwhelmed. And yet, despite the horrors they had witnessed, the men of Taffy 3 knew they had done something extraordinary. They had faced the impossible and come out on the other side. Aftermath of the battle. Heavy losses. The Battle of Samar, though a victory for the United States, would be forever marred by the tremendous cost of life. The survivors of Taffy 3 returned home as heroes, but their victory was bittersweet. They had turned back the might of the Japanese fleet, but they had lost so much in the process. Over 1,000 men had died, and countless others had been wounded or lost at sea. The story of their bravery, of the courage that allowed them to stand against overwhelming odds, would become a symbol of American resilience. Their story would be passed down from one generation to the next, inspiring future sailors, soldiers, and civilians alike. But for the men who had fought that day, the true legacy lay not in the medals or the recognition they received, but in the memories of the friends they had lost, the ships that had been sunk, and the sacrifices they had made. As the years passed, the USS John C. Butler continued her service in the Korean War, a symbol of the enduring courage and strength of the men who had sailed aboard her. The ship was decommissioned in 1946 and returned to the seas one final time in 1971, where she was used as a target for military exercises. But her legacy, the legacy of Taffy III, would live on forever. In the quiet annals of history, the story of the USS John C. Butler endures. It is a story of courage, defiance, and sacrifice. A story that proves that even the smallest ships, when manned by the bravest of men, can make history. Legacy of Taffy III, USS John C. Butler's enduring impact.